The sun had barely risen over the Texas plains when Sarah Mitchell picked up the wooden bucket from beside the kitchen table. Her mother's labored breathing filled the small cabin, each wheeze a reminder that time was running short. The doctor from town had been cleared during his last visit 3 weeks ago. Consumption was claiming another life, and there wasn't much anyone could do except keep the patient comfortable. Sarah's bare feet moved silently across the rough wooden floor as she made her way to the door. At 22, she had already lived through more hardship than most women twice her age. Her father had died 2 years earlier when his horse spooked during a thunderstorm, leaving her to care for her ailing mother and their small homestead 15 miles outside of Fort Worth. The morning air carried a hint of autumn coolness, though the Texas heat would return by midday. Sarah wrapped her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and began the familiar walk to the creek that ran behind their property. This journey had become as regular as sunrise itself, twice each day, sometimes 3 times when her mother's fever spiked and she needed extra water for cooling cloths. The creek was nearly a quarter-mile from the cabin, winding through mesquite trees and tall grass that whispered secrets in a morning breeze. Sarah had worn a clear path through the vegetation over the past months, her feet knowing every rock and root along the way. She moved quickly but carefully, mindful that a twisted ankle could mean disaster when no neighbors lived within shouting distance. As she knelt beside the slow-moving water, Sarah allowed herself a moment to rest. The bucket felt heavier each day, though she knew it wasn't the weight that tired her. It was the burden of watching her mother fade away, knowing that each trip to the creek brought them closer to the end. The water ran clear and cool, fed by underground springs that had sustained this land long before white settlers arrived. Sarah had heard stories from old-timers about the Comanche who once camped along this very creek, following the buffalo herds across the endless grass. Those days seemed like ancient history now, though it had been less than 20 years since the last conflicts in the area. She dipped the bucket carefully, watching as the water swirled and settled. A red-winged blackbird called from somewhere in the cattails, its song mixing with the gentle gurgle of the current. For just a moment, Sarah let herself imagine what it might be like to simply sit by the water without the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. But her mother's coughing, carried on the morning air from the direction of the cabin, reminded her that daydreaming was a luxury she couldn't afford. Sarah lifted the full bucket and began the return journey, water sloshing gently with each step. The cabin came into view as she crested a small rise, its weathered walls and sagging roof telling the story of years spent battling wind, rain, and scorching sun. Smoke drifted from the chimney where Sarah had banked the coals before leaving, ready to coax back to life for cooking breakfast. Inside, her mother lay, propped up on pillows, her once strong frame now fragile beneath the patchwork quilt. Martha Mitchell had been a robust woman who could work alongside any man, but the disease had stolen her strength month by month. Her gray hair, once thick and lustrous, now lay thin and damp against her skull. "Sarah," Martha's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm here, Mama." Sarah set the bucket beside the bed and poured fresh water into the ceramic basin on the nightstand. She wrung out a clean cloth and gently wiped her mother's fevered brow. "Did you see anything unusual this morning?" Martha asked, her eyes bright with fever but still sharp with concern. "Just the usual birds and maybe a few rabbits," Sarah replied, though something in her mother's tone made her pause. "Why do you ask?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her breathing shallow and labored. "I've been having dreams," she said finally. "Dreams about the old days when your father and I first came here. There were signs then, warnings we should have heeded." Sarah had heard fragments of these stories before, but her mother had always been reluctant to share details about their early years on the frontier. She dipped the cloth again and continued her gentle ministrations, hoping her mother would elaborate. The Comanche knew this land better than anyone. Martha continued, her gaze fixed on something beyond the cabin walls. They understood its rhythms, its moods. Your father thought we could simply claim a piece of it and make it ours, but the land doesn't forget." These words sent a small chill down Sarah's spine. Her mother had always been practical, focused on the immediate tasks of survival rather than dwelling on the past or entertaining superstitions. This talk of dreams and forgotten warnings was unlike her. "You just tire, Mama. The fever makes everything seem strange." Sarah squeezed the excess water from the cloth and folded it neatly. "Try to rest while I start breakfast." But as she moved about the small kitchen area, measuring cornmeal and checking the preserves, Sarah found herself glancing repeatedly toward the window that faced the creek. The morning seemed ordinary enough, with meadowlarks singing in the distance and a gentle breeze stirring the grass. Yet something felt different, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation. She mixed batter for Johnny cakes, the familiar routine providing comfort in its predictability. The cast iron skillet heated slowly over the rebuilt fire, and soon the cabin filled with the homey smell of cooking cornbread. Sarah had become an accomplished cook out of necessity, learning to make filling meals from whatever provisions they could afford or grow themselves. Their small vegetable garden behind the cabin provided beans, squash, and corn when the weather cooperated. A few chickens scratched in their wire enclosure, offering eggs when they felt generous. It wasn't much, but it had been enough to sustain them through the difficult months since her father's death. As the Johnny cakes cooked, Sarah prepared weak tea from the last of their store-bought leaves, sweetening it with a precious spoonful of honey. Her mother's appetite had dwindled to almost nothing, but she could sometimes be coaxed to take liquids. "Breakfast is ready, Mama," Sarah called softly, turning the golden cakes in the skillet. There was no response. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the bedside, alarmed by the silence. But Martha's chest still rose and fell in the uneven rhythm that had become familiar, and her eyes opened when Sarah touched her shoulder. "I'm not very hungry this morning," Martha murmured. "Just a little tea then, and maybe half a Johnny cake. You need to keep up your strength." Sarah helped her mother sit up higher against the pillows and held the cup while she took small sips. The simple act of swallowing seemed to require enormous effort, and Sarah had to blink back tears at this evidence of how far the disease had progressed. After breakfast, Sarah settled into the routine that structured their days. She swept the cabin floor, tended the fire, and checked on her small store of supplies in the root cellar. The afternoon would bring another trip to the creek, followed by evening chores and the preparation of supper. It was a life measured in small tasks and quiet moments, far removed from the bustling communities where other young women her age might be attending social gatherings or receiving callers. Sarah sometimes wondered what might have been different if they had stayed in the more settled areas back east. But such thoughts served no useful purpose. As she worked, her mother dozed fitfully, occasionally murmuring words that Sarah couldn't quite catch. Once she thought she heard her father's name, mixed with phrases in what might have been another language altogether. The fever often brought confusion, mixing memories with dreams in ways that seemed more real than waking life. The sun climbed higher, bringing the heat that would make the cabin stifling by afternoon. Sarah opened both the front and back doors to encourage any breeze that might offer relief. Through the back door, she could see their small garden where late tomatoes still hung heavy on the vine, and beyond it the vast expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon. This was beautiful country when viewed with an eye for its wild majesty rather than its challenges. Rolling hills covered in tall grass that moved like ocean waves in the wind, dotted with groves of oak and mesquite that provided shade and shelter for countless creatures. In spring, wildflowers painted the landscape in brilliant colors that could take your breath away. But it was also unforgiving country that demanded strength and determination from those who chose to make their lives here. Water could be scarce during dry spells, winters could bring killing cold, and isolation meant that any crisis had to be faced without help from others. Sarah had been born to this life and knew no other, but sometimes she wondered if her mother regretted the choices that had brought them to this remote cabin. Martha rarely spoke of her childhood in Missouri or the family she had left behind when she married Thomas Mitchell and followed him west in search of opportunity. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself thinking more about her mother's strange words about dreams and warnings. Martha had lived through the transition from a frontier where conflict with native tribes was a real and constant threat to the more settled present, where such concerns seemed like echoes from a distant past. What signs had her parents ignored when they first arrived? What warnings might they have heeded that could have changed the course of their lives? These questions followed Sarah as she went about her tasks, adding an undercurrent of unease to what should have been an ordinary day. When the time came for the afternoon trip to the creek, Sarah found herself hesitating at the door. There was no logical reason for her reluctance. She had made this journey hundreds of times without incident. Yet something in her mother's fevered words had awakened an awareness of how vulnerable they were, two women alone on the vast prairie with no one to turn to if trouble arose. She picked up the bucket and stepped outside, forcing herself to move with her usual purposeful stride. The sun was directly overhead now, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made the distant horizon dance and blur. Grasshoppers clicked in the tall grass, and somewhere a hawk cried as it circled high above, riding the thermal currents in its endless search for prey. The familiar path to the creek seemed longer than usual, and Sarah found herself pausing to listen at every rustle of grass or call of a bird. She told herself she was being foolish, letting her mother's fevered dreams affect her own normally steady nerves. But the feeling persisted that something was watching from the tall grass, something that understood this land far better than she ever could. Sarah reached the creek without incident, but the unease that had been building throughout the morning crystallized into something more tangible when she noticed fresh horse tracks in the soft mud along the water's edge. The prints were unshod, made by ponies rather than the heavy draft horses that most settlers used, and they were recent enough that water still seeped slowly into the deepest impressions. She knelt beside the tracks, her heart beginning to race as she studied the pattern. There had been at least 3 horses, maybe 4, and they had stopped here to drink before moving on toward the south. The riders had dismounted briefly. She could see the outline of moccasined feet in the mud alongside the hoof prints. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she filled her bucket, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding area for any sign of movement. Stories from her childhood flooded back, tales told by neighboring families about encounters with Comanche raiding parties who could appear and disappear like ghosts across the landscape. Most of those stories belonged to an earlier time, before the military campaigns that had driven the tribes onto reservations far from this area. But not all Comanche had surrendered to reservation life. Everyone knew there were still small bands that preferred their traditional ways, moving freely across the land their ancestors had claimed long before white settlers arrived. These groups generally avoided contact with homesteaders, but their presence was sometimes revealed by signs like the one Sarah now stared at in growing alarm. The water in her bucket sloshed violently as she hurried back toward the cabin, no longer caring about spilling. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger, and every sound made her start and look over her shoulder. The tall grass that had always seemed beautiful and peaceful now appeared threatening, offering countless places for riders to remain hidden until they chose to reveal themselves. She burst through the cabin door with such force that Martha startled awake, her fevered eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Sarah? What's wrong, child?" There were tracks by the creek, Mama, horse tracks, and footprints, fresh ones. Sarah set the bucket down with shaking hands and moved to the window, peering out through the gap between the curtains. Martha struggled to sit up higher, her face pale but alert. "How many horses?" 3 or 4, I think. Unshod ponies, and whoever was riding them stopped to water their horses and rest. "Did you see which direction they went?" "South, toward the Brazos River country." Martha was quiet for a long moment, her breathing labored but her mind clearly working through the implications. "Help me to the window," she said finally. Sarah supported her mother's frail form as Martha made her way across the cabin. Despite her weakness, The older woman's eyes were sharp as she studied the landscape visible from their vantage point. "Your father built this cabin well," Martha said quietly. "Good sight lines in all directions, and the creek is far enough away that anyone approaching would have to cross open ground. But we're still vulnerable if they decide to visit. Should I try to get to town? I could saddle Belle and be in Fort Worth before nightfall." Martha shook her head slowly. "Too risky. If there are riders out there, they'll see you coming long before you see them. Better to stay here and hope they're just passing through." They spent the rest of the afternoon taking turns at the window, watching for any sign of movement across the prairie. Sarah cleaned her father's old Springfield rifle and made sure the ammunition was ready, though she had never fired it at anything larger than rabbits, and knew her marksmanship was questionable at best. As evening approached, Martha's fever seemed to worsen, and she began speaking again about her dreams. But now her words carried a different weight, as if the presence of real danger had given substance to what had seemed like mere delirium. "I dreamed about him again last night," Martha whispered, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window. "A warrior on a painted horse, watching our cabin from the ridge to the east. In the dream, he wasn't threatening, more like he was keeping vigil, waiting for something. Mama, you need to rest. The fever makes everything seem more real than it is. But what if it's not just fever?" Martha's grip on Sarah's hand was surprisingly strong. "What if some things are meant to be, and we're just too stubborn to see the signs?" Sarah didn't know how to answer. Her practical nature rebelled against the idea of prophetic dreams and supernatural warnings, but the fresh tracks by the creek were undeniably real. Someone was out there in the darkness that was beginning to settle over the prairie, and their intentions remained unknown. She prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, though neither woman had much appetite. The familiar routine of cooking and cleaning provided some comfort, but Sarah found herself constantly glancing toward the windows, watching for any flicker of movement that might indicate they were being observed. Night fell with the sudden completeness common to the plains, darkness dropping like a curtain across the landscape. Sarah banked the fire to just a few glowing coals and extinguished all the candles except one small flame that she kept burning near her mother's bedside. Too much light would make them visible to anyone watching from outside, but complete darkness would leave them helpless if trouble came calling. She settled into a chair beside Martha's bed, the Springfield rifle across her knees, and her ears straining for any sound that didn't belong to the normal night chorus of insects and small creatures. An owl called from somewhere near the creek, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, answered by others of its pack. "Sarah," Martha's voice was barely audible above her labored breathing. "Come closer." Sarah leaned in, smelling the sickness that no amount of washing could completely mask. "There are things I should have told you before now," Martha continued. "About the early days here, about your father, and the choices we made. You can tell me tomorrow when you're feeling stronger." "No, child. Tomorrow might be too late." Martha's eyes were bright with fever, but lucid. "When we first came here, we weren't the only ones interested in this land. There was a Comanche chief named Iron Sky who claimed this area as part of his people's traditional hunting grounds." Sarah felt a chill despite the warmth of the cabin. This was the first time she had heard this name or any specific details about conflicts with local tribes. "Your father was a stubborn man, God rest his soul, and he refused to consider that anyone else might have a legitimate claim to this creek and the good water it provided. Iron Sky tried to negotiate. He offered to share the water rights in exchange for certain guarantees about how the land would be used." "What kind of guarantees?" "That we wouldn't fence the traditional paths his people used to reach the river. That we wouldn't hunt the buffalo to extinction like some of the commercial hunters were doing. That we would respect the sacred sites marked by stone cairns throughout the area." Martha paused to catch her breath, the effort of speaking clearly taking its toll. Sarah waited patiently, sensing that these revelations were important in ways she didn't yet understand. "Your father saw these requests as unreasonable demands from people who had no legal right to the land. He filed his claim with the territorial government, and hired men with guns to enforce it. Iron Sky and his band moved on rather than fight, but not before the chief made certain predictions about what would happen to families who chose conflict over cooperation. What kind of predictions? That the land would exact its own price from those who took it by force. That sickness would come to houses built on dishonor. That children would pay for their parents' mistakes. Sarah felt her heart pounding as the implications of her mother's words sank in. You think Papa's death and your illness are somehow connected to what happened with this Iron Sky. I don't know what I think anymore, Martha admitted. But I do know that refusing to listen to those who understand this land better than we do was a mistake that has haunted me for 20 years. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of these revelations settling between them like a physical presence. Outside, the night sounds continued their eternal rhythms, but now they seemed to carry messages that Sarah lacked the knowledge to interpret. Is Iron Sky still alive? She asked finally. I don't know. He would be an old man by now if he survived the reservation years. Many of the traditional chiefs died rather than submit to that kind of life. But some of his people might still be out there, living the old ways. Martha nodded slowly. It's possible. And if those tracks you saw today belong to his descendants, they might be here for reasons we don't understand. Sarah stood and moved to the window again, peering out into the darkness that seemed to press against the glass like a living thing. Somewhere out there, riders on painted horses might be watching their cabin, weighing decisions that could affect her and her mother's fate. She thought about the warrior her mother had described in her dreams, keeping vigil on the eastern ridge. Was it possible that they were being protected rather than threatened? The idea seemed incredible, but then everything about this day had challenged her understanding of their situation. A sound from outside made her freeze, the soft whinny of a horse, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough away to indicate the animal wasn't in their small corral. Sarah's grip tightened on the rifle as she tried to determine the direction of the sound. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Martha nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else that might have been anticipation. "They're coming closer." Sarah blew out the candle, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. In the sudden blackness, every sound seemed magnified. Her mother's labored breathing, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls, and, somewhere outside, the soft sound of movement through tall grass. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness as they waited in the darkness, listening for signs that would reveal the intentions of their unseen visitors. Sarah's hands were slick with sweat where they gripped the rifle, and her heart hammered so loudly she was afraid it might give away their location. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sense of immediate danger passed. The night sounds resumed their normal patterns, and the feeling of being watched gradually faded. But Sarah remained at the window until the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, knowing that everything had changed and that the coming day would bring new challenges they might not be prepared to face. Dawn brought no relief from the tension that had gripped Sarah throughout the sleepless night. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the prairie around their cabin, she could see clear evidence that their property had indeed been visited during the dark hours. New tracks crisscrossed the yard, and several of their chickens lay scattered near the coop, killed but not taken, a sign that confused rather than alarmed her. If raiders had wanted to steal livestock or supplies, they would have taken the chickens. Instead, it appeared that someone had simply silenced the birds to prevent them from raising an alarm. This suggested a level of consideration that didn't match the story she had heard about hostile encounters with Comanche war parties. Martha's condition had worsened during the night, and she now burned with fever that left her barely conscious. Sarah bathed her mother's face with cool water from the bucket she had filled the previous day, reluctant to make another trip to the creek until she better understood their situation. As she tended her mother, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Propped against the window frame, visible from outside but not immediately obvious to anyone inside the cabin, was a single eagle feather tied with a strip of red cloth. She had not placed it there, and Its presence could mean only one thing. Someone had approached close enough to the cabin during the night to leave this token. Sarah stared at the feather for several minutes, tried to recall everything she had ever heard about native customs and symbols. Eagle feathers were sacred to most tribes, often carried by warriors and medicine men as signs of honor and spiritual power. But what message was this particular feather meant to convey? She left her mother's bedside and carefully opened the front door, stepping outside to examine their surroundings more closely. The tracks in the yard told a story of organized movement. Horses had been positioned at strategic points around the cabin while their riders moved on foot, apparently conducting some kind of surveillance or assessment. Near the chicken coop, she found another puzzling sign. Arranged in a neat circle were 7 smooth stones that had definitely not been there the previous evening. In the center of the circle, someone had placed a small bundle wrapped in deer hide and tied with sinew. Sarah approached the bundle cautiously, her mind racing through possibilities. This could be anything from a warning to a gift, and handling it inappropriately might send the wrong message to whoever had left it. But curiosity and desperation finally overcame her caution, and she carefully untied the sinew binding. Inside the hide wrapping, she discovered items that left her stunned and confused. There was a small clay pot containing what appeared to be dried herbs, their earthy smell both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. Beside the pot lay 3 silver coins of a type she had never seen, marked with symbols rather than words. And wrapped in a piece of soft leather was a necklace made from polished stones and bear claws, clearly crafted by skilled hands. But it was the final item in the bundle that truly mystified her. Carved for what looked like buffalo bone was a small figure of a woman carrying a water vessel, the details so precise that Sarah could see the strain in the figure's shoulders and the determination in her carved features. The resemblance to her own daily journey to the creek was unmistakable. A sound from inside the cabin called her attention back to her mother, and Sarah quickly rewrapped the bundle, taking it with her as she hurried inside. Martha was awake and struggling to sit up, her eyes wild with fever and confusion. "Sarah, did they come? Did you see him? Someone was here, Mama. They left things of feather in this bundle." Sarah showed her mother the items from the hide wrapping, watching as Martha's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching wonder. "The herbs," Martha whispered, reaching for the clay pot with trembling fingers. "These are for fever and lung sickness. I recognize some of them from remedies my grandmother used back in Missouri. You think they're meant to help you? I don't know what else to think." Martha held the pot close to her chest, tears streaming down her fevered cheeks. After all these years of sickness and struggle, why would strangers want to help us? Sarah examined the carved figure again, noting details she had missed in her initial surprise. The woman's face bore an expression of quiet dignity despite the obvious burden she carried. Around the base of the carving, tiny symbols had been etched with incredible precision: birds, water, and what might have been representations of the phases of the moon. "Mama, you said Iron Sky made predictions about what would happen to families who took the land by force. Did he say anything about how those consequences might be lifted?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her breathing shallow as she struggled with pain and the effects of the fever. "He spoke of understanding," she said finally, "of learning to see the land as something to be stewarded rather than owned. And he said that sometimes the children must finish what their parents began, for better or worse." The implications of these words sent a chill through Sarah despite the growing warmth of the morning. If her mother's illness was somehow connected to her father's refusal to negotiate with Iron Sky, then perhaps the mysterious gifts were an opportunity to set things right. She prepared tea using some of the herbs from the clay pot, following instincts she didn't fully understand. The mixture had a pleasant, earthy smell that seemed to clear her mother's breathing almost immediately. Martha drank the tea slowly, and within an hour her fever had begun to break for the first time in weeks. As her mother rested more peacefully than she had in months, Sarah found herself drawn repeatedly to the windows, watching for any sign of the mysterious visitors. The morning passed quietly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being observed by patient eyes that missed nothing. Around midday, she spotted movement on the ridge to the east, exactly where her mother had said the dream warrior kept his vigil. A lone rider sat motionless on a painted horse, too distant for Sarah to make out details, but close enough to confirm that they were indeed being watched. The rider remained in place for perhaps an hour before disappearing beyond the ridge, but Sarah knew he would return. These visits were not random encounters, but part of some larger pattern that she was only beginning to understand. That afternoon, Martha's improvement continued at a pace that seemed almost miraculous. Her breathing eased, her fever remained low, and for the first time in weeks, she was able to eat solid food without immediately becoming nauseous. The herbs in the clay pot had accomplished what months of doctoring from Fort Worth had failed to achieve. As evening approached, Sarah made the decision to return to the creek for fresh water. The bucket beside her mother's bed was nearly empty, and despite her lingering nervousness about venturing away from the cabin, she knew the water was essential for Martha's continued recovery. She took the rifle with her, but left it unloaded, sensing somehow that appearing armed might send the wrong message to whoever was monitoring their activities. The walk to the creek felt different this time, as if the very landscape had shifted in subtle ways that her conscious mind couldn't quite identify. At the creek bank, Sarah found fresh evidence of her mysterious benefactors. Someone had cleared debris from the best spot for drawing water and had even placed flat stones to create a more stable footing. The thoughtfulness of these small improvements suggested a level of care that went far beyond simple charity. As she knelt to fill her bucket, Sarah became aware that she was no longer alone. Without looking up, she knew that someone was watching her from the tall grass on the opposite bank of the creek. The feeling was unmistakable, but strangely it carried no threat, only a sense of patient evaluation. She continued with her task, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any actions that might be interpreted as aggressive or fearful. When the bucket was full, she stood and turned toward the opposite bank, hoping to catch a glimpse of her observer. What she saw took her breath away. Standing among the cattails, so still he seemed part of the landscape itself, was a man of perhaps 60 years with long gray hair and skin weathered by decades of sun and wind. He wore traditional Comanche clothing decorated with beadwork and feathers, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to see straight through to her soul. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the narrow creek, neither moving nor speaking. Sarah felt no fear, only a profound sense that this meeting had been inevitable from the moment she first carried water for her dying mother. The man raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or blessing, then melted back into the tall grass with movements so fluid he seemed to simply vanish. Sarah stood frozen by the creek bank for several minutes, wondering if the encounter had been real or a product of her exhausted and overwrought imagination. But when she looked down, she saw that someone had placed another gift beside her bucket while her attention was focused on the figure across the creek. This time, it was a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be corn pollen, along with a piece of bark covered with symbols that looked like some form of primitive writing. Sarah gathered these new gifts and made her way back to the cabin, her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. When she showed Martha the bark and its mysterious symbols, the older woman's eyes widened with recognition. "I've seen markings like these before," Martha said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Your father found similar symbols carved on rocks throughout this area when we first arrived. He thought they were just random scratches made by animals, but now I wonder if they might have been something more." "Like what?" "Messages, perhaps, or maps showing safe paths through the territory." The Comanche were known for leaving signs that could be read by those who understood their meaning. Sarah studied the bark more closely, noting how certain symbols seemed to repeat in patterns that suggested a form of language or code. If these markings contained instructions or information relevant to their situation, she lacked the knowledge to interpret them. But She was beginning to suspect that interpretation might not be her responsibility alone. The careful attention being paid to their welfare suggested that someone was guiding events toward a specific outcome, and her role might be to simply trust in processes she didn't fully understand. As night fell once again, Sarah found herself less anxious than she had been the previous evening. Martha's dramatic improvement had lifted a burden of despair that had been growing heavier for months, and the mysterious gifts suggested that they had allies rather than enemies watching from the darkness. She prepared another tea from the healing herbs and helped her mother drink it before settling into her chair beside the bed. This time she left the rifle in the corner, sensing that weapons would be unnecessary during the hours of darkness ahead. Sarah woke before dawn to find her mother sitting up in bed, alert and breathing easily for the first time in months. The transformation was so dramatic that for a moment Sarah wondered if she was still dreaming. Martha's eyes were clear and bright. Her color had returned to something approaching normal, and the terrible rattling cough that had plagued her for weeks was completely gone. "Mama, how do you feel?" "Like I've been given a second chance at life," Martha replied, her voice stronger than Sarah had heard it in months. Those herbs worked a miracle that no doctor could have achieved. They spent the early morning hours talking quietly, both women marveling at the sudden change in circumstances. Martha was able to eat a full breakfast of eggs and cornbread, and she insisted on getting dressed and moving around the cabin despite Sarah's concerns about overexertion. "I've been lying in that bed, dying by inches for months," Martha said as she brushed her thinning hair. "I'm not going to waste whatever time I've been given by continuing to act like an invalid." As the sun rose higher, Sarah prepared to make her daily trip to the creek, but this time Martha announced her intention to come along. Despite her dramatic improvement, Sarah worried that the quarter-mile walk might be too much too soon. "I need to see this place where our mysterious benefactors have been leaving their gifts," Martha insisted. "And there are things I need to do that I should have done 20 years ago." They walked slowly toward the creek, Martha leaning on Sarah's arm, but managing the journey better than expected. Along the way, she pointed out features of the landscape that Sarah had never noticed. Subtle markers in the form of stone arrangements and carved symbols on tree trunks that suggested a complex system of communication and navigation. "Your father and I were so focused on the immediate challenges of survival that we never took time to truly see this place," Martha explained. "We thought of it as empty land waiting to be claimed, but it was never empty. It was simply occupied by people whose ways of living were different from ours." At the creek, they found another gift waiting. This time it was a beautifully woven basket containing fresh roots and berries, along with what appeared to be jerked meat prepared with unfamiliar but appealing spices. Beside the basket, someone had arranged smooth river stones in a pattern that looked like a map or diagram. Martha studied the stone arrangement with growing excitement. "I think this might be showing us something important," she said, tracing the pattern with her finger. "Look how these stones form pathways leading to this central circle. And see how this line of smaller stones seems to follow the course of the creek." Sarah looked more carefully and began to see what her mother meant. The arrangement did resemble a map, with a central circle possibly representing their cabin and the various pathways indicating routes across the surrounding territory. But the purpose of such a map remained unclear. As they knelt beside the stone pattern, both women became aware that they were being watched. This time the observers made no attempt to remain hidden. 3 men on horseback sat on the ridge overlooking the creek, close enough that their features were clearly visible. The rider in the center was the same elderly man Sarah had encountered the previous day, his gray hair braided with feathers and his weathered face bearing the dignity of someone accustomed to leadership. The 2 younger men flanking him wore similar traditional clothing and carried themselves with the quiet confidence of skilled warriors. Martha struggled to her feet, Sarah supporting her elbow as the older woman faced their observers. For several long moments, the 2 groups regarded each other across the distance, tension building like the charge in the air before a thunderstorm. Then, Martha did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. She raised both hands above her head in what Sarah recognized as a gesture of surrender or peaceful intent, and called out across the creek in a voice that carried clearly in the morning air. "Iron Sky, if that's who you are, I want to talk." The elderly rider urged his horse down the slope toward the creek, his companions following at a respectful distance. As they approached, Sarah could see that the man's eyes held a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if he too was uncertain about how this encounter might unfold. When the riders reached the opposite bank of the creek, the elderly man dismounted and waded across the shallow water without hesitation. Up close, Sarah could see that he moved with the fluid grace of someone much younger, despite the lines etched deep around his eyes and the gray that streaked his long hair. "I am Iron Sky," he said in English that carried only a slight accent. "And you're Martha Mitchell, wife of Thomas Mitchell who claimed this land 23 years ago." "I am. And this is my daughter Sarah, who has been carrying water for her dying mother and wondering why the land seems to have turned against our family." Iron Sky's gaze shifted to Sarah, and she felt as if those dark eyes could see directly into her heart. "Your daughter has shown respect for the water and the earth," he said quietly. "She takes only what is needed and gives thanks in her own way. This is why we decided to offer help instead of judgment." "The herds you left saved my life," Martha said. "I don't understand why you would help the family of a man who treated you with such disrespect." "Because the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children," Iron Sky replied. "And because this land has spoken to me in dreams, telling me that the time has come to heal old wounds rather than let them fester for another generation." He gestured toward the stone arrangement beside the creek. "This map shows the traditional pathways that my people use to move safely through this territory. For hundreds of years, these routes connected sacred sites and seasonal camps, allowing us to live in harmony with the rhythms of the earth." Sarah looked at the stones again, now understanding that each pathway represented knowledge accumulated over countless generations. "You want us to learn about these routes? I want you to understand that this land can support your family and mine without conflict, if we are willing to share rather than fight over ownership," Iron Sky explained. "Your father's refusal to consider such cooperation brought sickness and misfortune to your house. But that curse can be lifted if you are willing to make different choices." Martha stepped forward, her newfound strength evident in her bearing. "What kind of choices?" "There are 5 sacred sites within the boundaries of your legal claim," Iron Sky said, pointing to specific stones in the map. "Stone circles built by my ancestors to mark places where the earth's power runs strong. Your father plowed through 2 of these sites and used stones from a third to build the foundation of your cabin." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications. "You're saying our cabin was built on sacred ground?" "Not exactly sacred, but connected to sacred places in ways that disrupted the flow of natural energies. This is why sickness came to your house, and why the land seemed to fight against your efforts to make it productive." "But the herbs you gave us cured my mother's consumption," Sarah pointed out. "If the land itself was against us, how could healing come from the same source?" Iron Sky smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Because the land is not truly against anyone. It simply responds to how it is treated. When you showed respect for the water and carried it faithfully to ease your mother's suffering, the earth recognized your devotion and decided to offer aid rather than resistance." The explanation made sense in ways that Sarah's rational mind struggled to accept, but her intuition embraced completely. She thought about the months of faithful trips to the creek, made without complaint even as her mother's condition seemed hopeless. Perhaps that persistence had indeed been noticed by forces larger than herself. "What would you need us to do?" Martha asked. "To make things right, I mean." "Help us restore the sacred sites that were damaged," Iron Sky said. "The stone circles can be rebuilt using the original materials plus others we will provide. And we need assurance that the traditional pathways will remain open for our people to use when traveling between summer and winter camps." "You still use this area?" for seasonal movement. My band is small now, only 37 people who prefer the old ways to life on the reservation. We harm no one and take only what the land freely offers, but we need to be able to move freely along routes our ancestors established long before boundaries were drawn on white men's maps. Sarah found herself thinking of the practical implications. What about our legal claim to this land? The government documents that give us title, keep your papers, and your legal ownership, Iron Sky said with a slight smile. But understand that some things are larger than human laws. The Earth recognizes older claims than those written on papers, and peace comes from acknowledging all legitimate relationships to the land. As they talked, the two younger Comanche men had dismounted and were examining the area around the creek with obvious interest. One of them called out something in their native language, and Iron Sky nodded before turning back to Sarah and Martha. My companions have found something that confirms this place was meant for cooperation rather than conflict, he said. Would you like to see? They followed him to a spot about 50 yards upstream where the younger men had cleared away accumulated brush and debris to reveal a natural spring that fed into the creek. Around the spring, someone had built a low wall of fitted stones that created a small pool of crystal clear water. This is why my people always camped in this area, Iron Sky explained. The spring never fails, even in the driest years, and the water has healing properties that our medicine men have known about for generations. Sarah stared at the spring in amazement. This was the source of the water she had been carrying faithfully to her mother, and she had never known of its existence or special qualities. The irony was not lost on her. In seeking to help her mother, she had unknowingly been drawing from a sacred source that connected her family to the indigenous history of their land. The herbs I gave you for your mother's sickness work best when mixed with water from this spring, Iron Sky continued. This is knowledge that could benefit your family and mine if we were willing to share it. As the full implications of their situation began to sink in, Sarah felt a mixture of wonder and responsibility settling on her shoulders. She and her mother had been given an opportunity to transform their relationship with the land and its original inhabitants, but such transformation would require courage and commitment that went far beyond anything she had previously imagined. The conversation continued for another hour, with Iron Sky patiently answering questions and explaining aspects of Comanche culture that helped Martha and Sarah understand the true complexity of their situation. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the foundation for an unprecedented partnership had been laid, though many details remained to be worked out. As Iron Sky prepared to leave, he handed Sarah a leather cord strung with colored beads. Wear this when you come to the creek, he said. It will let my people know that you are under our protection and that the water you carry serves a purpose larger than your immediate needs. Sarah accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that she was accepting more than just a piece of jewelry. She was agreeing to become part of a story that stretched back generations and would hopefully extend forward into a future where two cultures could coexist with mutual respect. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The daily trips to the creek became opportunities for learning about the land from a completely new perspective. Iron Sky and his companions visited regularly, teaching her to identify medicinal plants, showing her how to read weather patterns in the behavior of birds and clouds, and gradually revealing the intricate system of knowledge that had allowed their people to thrive in this country for countless generations. Martha's recovery continued at a pace that amazed everyone who knew her previous condition. The combination of herbs from the sacred spring and the lifting of what Iron Sky called the burden of dishonor had given her vitality that made her seem years younger. She threw herself into the project of restoring the damaged sacred sites with an energy that sometimes worried Sarah. The first circle they rebuilt was located about half a mile north of the cabin, on a small rise that commanded a view of the surrounding prairie. Thomas Mitchell had scattered the original stones when clearing the area for a wheat field that had never prospered. Now Sarah and Martha worked alongside Iron Sky's people to gather those stones and return them to their proper places, following patterns that had been maintained for centuries. The work was harder than Sarah had expected, requiring not just physical effort, but careful attention to directions and alignments that seemed to follow astronomical rather than geographic principles. Iron Sky explained that each circle was oriented to mark important celestial events: the rising of particular stars, the positions of the moon during certain seasons, the points where the sun touched the horizon during solstices and equinoxes. Your father saw these as random piles of rocks that interfered with his farming, Iron Sky told them as they positioned the final stone in the first circle. But they're actually calendars that help us track the rhythms that govern all life on the plains. As autumn deepened into winter, the partnership between the two families grew stronger and more complex. Sarah found herself learning a new language, not just the Comanche words that Iron Sky patiently taught her, but the language of the land itself. She began to notice things that had previously escaped her attention. The way certain grasses grew only in areas with underground water, how the behavior of insects could predict changes in weather, and the subtle signs that indicated the presence of game animals or potential dangers. Martha, meanwhile, had discovered a talent for working with the healing plants that grew throughout their property. Under the guidance of Iron Sky's daughter-in-law, a woman named Bright Moon who possessed extensive knowledge of traditional medicine, Martha learned to prepare remedies that proved effective for ailments ranging from simple cuts and burns to more serious conditions like the consumption that had nearly claimed her life. The cabin became an unofficial meeting place where two cultures shared knowledge and stories. Sarah learned about the great buffalo herds that had once darkened the prairie, about the complex relationships between different tribes, and about the spiritual beliefs that connected Iron Sky's people to every aspect of the natural world. In return, she shared what she knew about farming techniques, food preservation, and the challenges of surviving on the frontier with limited resources. But it was the stories about water that fascinated Sarah most. Iron Sky explained that every creek, spring, and river had its own spirit and its own role in the greater pattern that sustained all life. The spring near their cabin was considered especially powerful because it connected to underground flows that emerged at sacred sites throughout the region. Water is the blood of the earth, Iron Sky told her during one of their conversations. When you carry it faithfully from the spring to your mother, you participate in the circulation that keeps all things alive. This is why your devotion was noticed and rewarded. As winter settled over the prairie, Sarah realized that her perspective on her daily routine had been completely transformed. What had once seemed like an endless burden, carrying water twice a day to ease her mother's suffering, now felt like a sacred duty that connected her to the land and its rhythms in ways she was only beginning to understand. The relationship with Iron Sky's band also brought practical benefits that neither Sarah nor Martha had anticipated. The Comanche possessed skills and knowledge that proved invaluable for surviving the harsh Texas winters. They showed the women how to modify their cabin for better heat retention, how to preserve meat using techniques that required no salt, and how to find edible plants even when the prairie appeared barren and lifeless. In return, Sarah and Martha shared their knowledge of European-style agriculture and animal husbandry. They helped Iron Sky's people understand how to deal with government officials and traders, and Martha's literacy skills proved valuable for navigating the legal complexities that increasingly affected everyone living on the frontier. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Iron Sky announced that his band would be moving to their traditional summer grounds near the Brazos River, but he extended an invitation for Sarah and Martha to join them for part of the journey. The trip would allow the women to see more of the sacred sites connected to their property and to understand how their small piece of land fit into the larger geographic and spiritual landscape that Iron Sky's people called home. Sarah was initially reluctant to leave the cabin for an extended period, but Martha's enthusiasm for the adventure eventually overcame her daughter's practical concerns. They spent weeks preparing for the journey, learning skills that would allow them to travel and camp in the traditional way. The experience of moving across the open prairie with Iron Sky's band opened Sarah's eyes to possibilities she had never imagined. She saw how a group of people could live comfortably while owning almost nothing, finding everything they needed from the land itself. She learned to ride in the Comanche style, to set up a teepee efficiently, and to read the subtle signs that indicated good campsites and safe routes. Most importantly, she began to understand the spiritual dimension of the relationship between Iron Sky's people and the land they traveled. Every landmark had significance, not just as a navigation aid, but as a repository of stories and teachings that connected the present generation to their ancestors and to the forces that shaped the world. During the weeks they spent traveling, Sarah found herself changing in ways that went far deeper than the acquisition of new skills. The young woman who had seen herself as isolated and burdened by circumstances beyond her control gradually transformed into someone who understood her place in a much larger story. When they returned to the cabin in late summer, both Sarah and Martha brought with them a new understanding of what it meant to live responsibly on land that had been shaped by countless generations of human presence. They continued the work of restoring the sacred sites, but now they understood these efforts as part of a larger project of healing relationships between cultures and between people and the earth itself. The final sacred site to be restored was the most challenging. It lay beneath the foundation of their cabin, requiring them to carefully excavate around the building's support posts to recover the original stones. The work took most of the autumn, but when it was completed, Sarah could feel a subtle but unmistakable change in the atmosphere around their home. "The circle is complete," Iron Sky said as they placed the last stone. "The energy flows freely once again, and the land recognizes your family as caretakers rather than conquerors." As winter approached once again, Sarah reflected on the year that had transformed her life so completely. Her mother's health remained strong. Their partnership with Iron Sky's band had enriched their lives in countless ways, and the land that had once seemed hostile now felt like a true home. But perhaps the most important change was in her understanding of what it meant to carry water. What had begun as a simple act of devotion to her dying mother had become a meditation on the connections that link all living things. Each trip to the sacred spring was now an opportunity to participate consciously in the great circulation that sustained life on the prairie. On Christmas morning, as she made her way through the snow to draw water for the day's needs, Sarah encountered Iron Sky sitting beside the spring in quiet contemplation. He had become like a grandfather to her, and his presence was always welcome. "The water still runs clear and strong," he observed as she filled her bucket. "It always has," Sarah replied. "I just didn't understand what that meant." "And now you do?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I think I'm beginning to, but I suspect it's the kind of understanding that takes a lifetime to fully develop." Iron Sky smiled and nodded. "That is wisdom, to know that true knowledge comes slowly, like water wearing away stone. Your faithfulness in carrying water for your mother opened a door that had been closed for 20 years. What lies beyond that door will take many years to fully explore." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the prairie, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place of understanding. She had begun the year as a young woman carrying water for her dying mother, isolated and desperate on the edge of a vast and seemingly hostile land. Now, she was part of a community that spanned cultures and generations, connected to the land and its rhythms in ways that gave meaning to even the simplest daily tasks. The water she carried each day was no longer just a necessity for survival. It was a sacrament that linked her to the sacred springs of wisdom that flowed beneath the surface of ordinary life. The bucket felt lighter as she walked back to the cabin where Martha was preparing breakfast, ready to begin another day in their transformed world. Behind her, Iron Sky remained beside the spring, continuing his morning meditation in a tradition that stretched back to the beginning of memory and forward into a future where two peoples would share the gift of clear, life-giving water.